Hello there, Drew Whiskey Lore, and time for another whiskey tasting and a bit of history, a little revision in history actually, because I've been doing this research on Tennessee whiskey history for my book, and what I have found is that so much of the history that I thought I knew because I'd read websites and I had read books, that history was correct. But as I'm going through, I'm finding a whole completely new story about Tennessee whiskey. And one of the people who, as I've dug in, I found out some very interesting information about is one George DIckel. And so you can hear a couple of things here that you've never heard before about this man. And then we'll do a tasting of this whiskey at the end of the episode. But interesting thing about George DIckel, I grew up in Western North Carolina, and when I was there, if you'd asked me what American whiskeys were, I would say Jack Daniel, Evan Williams, and George DIckel, all names. Because those are the ones that stuck in my head, and because George DIckel was distributed mostly in North Carolina and Tennessee. So we were one of the target markets for George DIckel. And so it surprised me, actually, that a lot of people, when I moved out of the area, didn't know who George DIckel was. Now they are, of course, under Diageo, and they are all over the place. So you can find George DIckel bottles in many places. Now, interesting thing is, we hear a name like Jack Daniels, George DIckel. Are these real people? They are real people. The confusing thing about George DIckel himself is that he had very little to do with the distillery. In fact, he was probably never at that distillery. He had taken a bad fall and was in bad health when Victor Schwab went to go buy the Cascade Hollow distillery. And that distillery had been operating for some time. And so you go, okay, I look at the bottle and I see this 1870 date as established, and makes you go, established in 1870. So was that when the distillery started, or was that when George DIckel got into the business? I don't know where that 1870 date comes from, because the research I have is to this point, and I'm going to verify this in Nashville this weekend, but it would have been in the 1860s when he started his liquor business. He would have been rectifying whiskey, and he would have been selling other people's products. So he kept this business going, but he did not have a distillery. What's interesting is I just actually got an email back from the Nashville library, where their archives are at. Almost every county in Tennessee has a archives building where you can go in and do some research on title deeds and all that sort of thing. And I've seen a few of them as I've been doing this work. Well, I had stumbled upon a newspaper article about George DIckel and Company suing Jack Daniel for $2,000, which was a pretty penny back in that day. And that would have been around 1886 that this happened. Now, this was not while George DIckel had a distillery at their disposal, which would lead one to believe that George DIckel, what was being sold by George DIckel, was likely, in part, coming from the Jack Daniels distillery. And this is one of those things that Lincoln County whiskey was very popular in Tennessee, and so it would have been something desirable to bring up. And so what I was looking for was more information on that court case. What I found out was that the charges were dismissed, and George A. DIckel and Company had to pay court costs because they decided to drop the suit. So they must have settled out of court. I wish they hadn't, in a way, because I'd love to see a court record to see what was that $2,000 argument about, because nowadays you have DIckel and Jack Daniel, from around 1956 7, 8, when the announcements were coming out that there was going to be another distillery in Tennessee. The competition begins, and now you got these two named distilleries. And for a long time, Tennessee whiskey was either Jack or George, and that was it. So interesting to see that they had that situation come up. But it ends up that Cascade Distillery was purchased, not completely, and this is another thing that I'm having to dig into, and I wish I could be more specific on this. Hopefully by the time I get the book out, I can be. But Macklin Davis was the distiller there. M.B. Sims was he was the guy that was always named whenever they talked about this particular distillery. Well, the distillery was Cascade Hollow, which is not the exact building they're in now, but was the building that they were in previously. So when they came back in the 1950s and rebuilt Cascade Hollow, they actually still use the same water source, but it's built in a completely different area. If you went to see where the distillery used to be, it's all trees now, so that you can't really see much of anything. George DIckel would end up dying. This was another interesting piece of information that I learned about George DIckel. When he died, it was mentioned that he was a Knights Templar. And me being a fan of the Da Vinci Code, I have to think, I wonder if George knew where Mary Magdalene's bones were buried. I read not too long ago, somebody said, oh, Knights Templar, that's a bunch of hooey, it never existed. Well, apparently it did, because George DIckel was a Knights Templar, and at his funeral, there was a large gathering of his brothers in the Knights Templar. So really interesting stuff. Anyway, there'll be more of this kind of fascinating stuff. I am right now in the editing process. I am trying to whittle the information down, because I probably have 400 plus pages of facts and details, and I got to figure out which ones are the most important for me to put in there and which ones I need to kind of scoot off to the side. So it will be interesting. So my nose is definitely a lot more attuned to whiskey this year over last year, because last year the only thing I was pulling out of it, this 12, was on the nose, the Flintstone vitamin note, this minerally note that George DIckel is known for. And I just think I was hyper focused on that at that particular moment. There is definitely a caramel note to this. Slight bit of, you could sort of sense a little bit of a rye note back there. Mash bill on this is 84% corn, 8% rye, and 8% malted barley. So this is the branding that says that this is Superior Recipe 12. If you go to their website, which is one of the most obnoxious websites, it's a pretty website, but it's almost impossible to navigate. It looks like they're rebranding this as Signature, and now that they have their bourbon out, because this is a Tennessee whiskey spelled without an E. They say on the website that it's spelled without an E because they want people to think of this as being up in quality along with Scotch whiskeys. Scotch whiskey is its own thing. Don't come at me with a corn whiskey and tell me that you want it to be on the same level with they're two different animals, okay? Two different animals. I'm not saying one is better than the other. That is up to your own palate. But I don't understand this concept of wanting to compare a corn whiskey to a Scotch. Maybe a blended Scotch, but anyway, there it is. I get a little bit of oak in there also. Very mild. Cheers. So it's not as corn heavy as you would think. Nice bit of coffee, caramel, coffee. There's no coffee notes in there. A little bit of caramel, some oak. If the butteriness comes in at all, it comes in on the finish. There is a nice little bit of pepperiness to it. It's interesting to note too that this bottle has been around for a year and a half with some oxidizing going on, so it may have evolved a little bit there in the bottle. But the finish kind of washes out a little bit. There's still feel a little bit of the heat there, but it's not a heavy whiskey once it gets to the finish. And the notes that do linger are very subtle, and probably a little bit of the oak and a little bit of a herbally note from the rye coming in on the finish, but just very, very light finish on that whiskey. Gonna do a second drink. I'm starting to do 2 sips on these because I feel like that first time you sip it, your mouth is not quite 100% engaged with it, and the second time you have taken enough whiskey in on your mouth that you're not getting other flavors that maybe were on your palate before interfering. There's a little cherry note that comes in, and actually a nice little bit of a leather note that comes in. I don't remember what the age is on this. I think it's probably around 8 year, maybe 8 to 10, somewhere in that range. That, of course, can always adjust. It is non-age stated. I'm guessing if they got rid of the 12 on the bottle, part of the reason is because there actually was a lawsuit not long ago against a distillery that was using a number on their bottle that did not signify an age. So that may be something that you start seeing going away. Or it could be because they now have an 8-year-old bourbon and they don't want to get you confused between that 8, the old 8, which is now apparently called Classic, and then the 12 Signature, which is formerly the Superior recipe. I hope you enjoyed this video. Are you a George DIckel fan? Have you tried some of their, they've come out with barrel proofs, and they've had their bottled in bond and a whole bunch of different stuff in there as well. Do you have a favorite George DIckel? Put it below. One of these days, especially when this bottle empties out, I will probably go get myself another bottle of something George DIckel, and it'd be interesting to know which one you guys would want me to review. Hope you enjoyed this little extra bit of history, something that's not on their website. And until next time, cheers and Slainte. Oh, the cola note in there too. And then the rye coming through. Yep. It's amazing for how much corn is in this that rye can stand up to it. And that the popcorn thing doesn't totally overwhelm it. It's there a little bit on the finish, that popcorn, buttery popcorn, but it dissipates. So